Hello and welcome. This is video number 12 in a 13-part series about World War II. And in this video, we're going to talk about the steps made by the United States to react to and recover from the Pearl Harbor attack and begin trying to chip away at the control that Japan had in the Pacific region. So let's get started. When we last talked about fighting in the Pacific, we had talked about the Pearl Harbor attack. That was really a kind of a high point, I guess you could say, for Japan in their attempt to control as much territory in the Pacific region as possible and to acquire as much territory as possible. And at the end of 1941, things looked pretty good for Japan. And I think the expectation with the Axis powers and the expectation with Japan is that they would have a lot of the things that they were seeking into the foreseeable future. I think they really felt like the damage that had been done at the Pearl Harbor attack was going to keep the United States out of the fight for some time. And truth be told, no one in the world, whether you're talking about the United States or Japan or any place else, knew what kind of reaction the United States was going to make, when it was going to happen. It was anybody's guess at that point. Fortunately, from our perspective, the comeback would begin much sooner rather than later. In fact, early in 1942, that comeback would begin. And so I want to just talk through some of the key steps towards the United States and the Allied side going from being at a disadvantage and in maybe a spot of weakness to taking the upper hand. And so the process really begins in April of 1942, or I guess even if you want to back it up just a little bit, the declaration of war that followed the Pearl Harbor attack, of course, was an important part of the process. And then just the steps that immediately started to be taken to train soldiers, to build war supplies, to rebuild things that had been damaged. All of that was a part of the process. But how quickly it unfolded, I think, surprised a lot of people, probably even people in the United States. Because our comeback began in April of 1942. It was a part of something called Doolittles Raid. And basically what this amounted to were planes flew to Tokyo, dropped some bombs on the city of Tokyo in Japan, and then returned home. It was one of those things where this was probably more of an emotional victory than a practical one. The damage that was done by the raid, the actual damage, was pretty minimal. But at the time it happened, I think, first of all, Japan was surprised that we were able to react with any kind of force in any way. And I also think that the people in Japan in particular felt pretty secure and insulated geographically. They were nowhere near the United States, and I don't think they anticipated, certainly not that soon, if not ever, that we would actually be able to reach into their country and strike them. And so it put a little bit of concern, a little bit of fear in the minds, at least of Japanese citizens at this point. And on the U.S. side, it was a real morale booster because we had gotten punched pretty hard with the Pearl Harbor attack, and now we had our opportunity to basically punch back. So this was a big step forward for the United States to feel good about how the process was unfolding. The next big thing that happened with the war in the Pacific is what's usually called the Battle of the Coral Sea. This was May of 1942. So that next month after Doolittle's Raid. Basically what this amounted to was in the Pacific region, getting near where Australia was at, the Allied side, of which we were a key part, intercepted a Japanese force that was on their way towards what would be a critical air base, Port Moresby. And this turned out to be a new kind of battle, a new kind of fight that would become pretty characteristic of fighting in the Pacific region. When this Japanese force was intercepted, the way the fighting took place was not to have the ships themselves fight each other or attack each other, but rather to have the ships, in essence, parked far away from each other to where they were actually out of view of each other, and actually use planes from the aircraft carriers to fly at the other side's ships, and try to take them out that way. Now, if you were scoring the Battle of the Coral Sea like points in a game, like a basketball game, Japan would have been declared the winner because Japan scored more points. However, if you want to look at it from what was the lasting impact of this battle, you could argue that the United States won the Battle of the Coral Sea, because one thing that stopped at this point was the Japanese advance, the continuing acquiring of more territory for Japan, stopped with the conclusion of the Battle of the Coral Sea. So Japan would never hold control of more territory than they did at this point. And from this point moving forward, they would actually lose territory. So again, you can look at the Battle of Coral Sea really from two directions. Objectively, with just losses, Japan inflicted more damage on us than we did on them. But long term, the Japanese advance was stopped with the Battle of the Coral Sea. Next big fight was the Battle of Midway. This was June of 1942, so just the next month after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Midway Island was an island of importance to the United States that was about 1,500 miles or so west of Hawaii, so just out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we had learned of plans that Japan had of trying to attack and take control of Midway Island. This would be something that they believed would be very advantageous for them. We would certainly find it troubling from our side to lose that. And because we had advanced knowledge of this, we were able to plan a little bit for what, if anything, to do about this attack on Midway Island. One of the things that Japan hoped might happen from attacking Midway Island was that we would devote all of our Pacific resources to trying to hold it, and that would leave places like Pearl Harbor vulnerable for Japanese attack. So again, with some advance notice, we were pretty strategic in how we went about dealing with this. Rather than just rush to defend the island itself, we actually kind of held back and let the attack begin. One of the interesting things about war at sea is the earth is round, and so even though you might be sitting in the ocean and everything looks flat, the reality is there's a curvature of the earth, and so you can, be a ways away from another ship and not see that ship. And so that's basically what we did. We kind of hid beneath the horizon line, waited for the attack to begin, which was largely Japanese planes going towards Midway Island. And once those planes had left, that's when we went ahead and attacked their ships. One of the things that we were able to really do damage to were their aircraft carriers. We were actually able to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, over 300 of the planes that they had, many of them still on the carriers at the time we attacked, were destroyed. And so this really crippled an important part of the Japanese naval fleet. And they basically limped away back towards home after the Battle of Midway. And so long-term significance of the Battle of Midway is the tide of the war, the momentum of the war in the Pacific was now favoring the United States. So basically half a year after the Pearl Harbor attack took place, the advantage was now United States. The last thing I'll talk about in this video is the Battle of Guadalcanal. This was August of 1942, so a couple of months after Midway. This is where we began a process that was called island hopping. General Douglas MacArthur was a leader of the military and the Pacific fighting, and his island hopping idea basically was to address the reality that Japan, to varying degrees, controlled a lot of little islands and little territories all throughout the Pacific region. And the view was, if we were to try to engage them in every place that they had established themselves, that it would not only take a long time, but there would be a lot of losses in the process. And the island hopping idea was to kind of ascertain where they more strongly held places and where they more weakly held places, and skip over the strongholds, take the easier to get places, and then cut off supplies to those stronger held areas that would then be behind the area that Japan controlled, and that eventually all of their stronger held places would wither away and fizzle out. And Guadalcanal was really just the beginning of this process of island hopping. Now, strategically, Guadalcanal was a good location for an air base, and so it was something that Japan definitely wanted to have, and as a result, we certainly didn't want them to be able to control that. And it was important enough that it led to a pretty lengthy fight. Some of these other battles lasted just a matter of days, like the Battle of Midway. Guadalcanal would actually last about 6 months. There would be a lot of brutal fighting. When you read the descriptions of what it was like in the Battle of Guadalcanal, basically think of anything that you can think of that's scary or disgusting or dangerous, and you probably found it there, whether it was intense heat, whether it was intense humidity, whether it was gigantic spiders, gigantic bats, gigantic rats, basically everything you could be afraid of apparently was there. Fortunately, from our perspective, the U.S. side, the Allied side, was able to ultimately win the Battle of Guadalcanal, and then that began the process of slowly but surely moving towards Japan. Well, I hope you found that information interesting and informative, and I hope you'll join me in the final video of the series where we talk about the final steps taken for the Allies to win the war in the Pacific and bring about an end to World War II overall. Thanks for watching.